Shots in the Dark contains graphic depictions of events that may not be suitable for all listeners. We encourage all of our listeners to be open-minded and engage in dialogue with us through any of our social media accounts or email.
Jesus is my friend.
He's always been a good friend of mine. Lately, Jesus got himself a girl, and I want to make her mine.
What is happening? I love you so dearly.
Hi, I'm Ty.
I'm Whitney.
And welcome back to a very special Campfire Tales episode of Shots in the Dark.
So for those of you that don't know, we try to do this monthly, but it's not always possible. But it's a longer episode on one topic, and one of us will tell a story, normally paranormally inclined.
Yeah.
Just like you'd tell your friends sitting out by a campfire.
Exactly. And last time it was you with your awesome story about Bachelor's Grove.
I know, but I'm excited about yours because we've talked about it forever. Yeah. Since this actually, I want to say this was the first thing that we got really into talking about.
It is, because I remember you calling dibs on Bachelor's Grove, which was unnecessary because I wouldn't have touched it anyway.
That would have killed you.
I would have only allowed you to do it. So you were like, I want to do it. You can't touch it. And I was like, okay, fine. But I get to call dibs on the Ursuline convent.
Well, this isn't even talking podcast. This is me saying that I'm pretty sure that the first thing that we talked about when we were sitting at Round the Clock when we met.
Oh.
Like, not the first thing, because obviously there's greetings and, like, idle chat, but I think the
and
first
salutations.
Yeah, exactly. I think the first paranormal thing that we talked about was the Ursuline Coven.
Yeah, and I'm sure that we talked about Bachelors, too, though. We had to have.
We had to have. I can't stop myself. Don't stop me now. I'm having such a good time.
Having a good time, having a good time. You wouldn't even know that I'm actually a little under the weather right now, and thus forth drinking a tea bomb that I've made myself to cure all my ailments.
It wasn't me. I didn't get him sick.
Except for I do have a little bit of a sexy sick voice happening.
Hi.
So
yeah, but you don't sound like a fucking goose.
No, I sound incrementally more masculine.
Yeah.
Ready to do our drink thing? Cheers.
Cheers.
But today we are going to talk about vampire folklore and history in New Orleans. Mm-hmm. One of the big things we're going to talk about is the Ursuline Convent, but we're going to go farther than that. So in order to really jump into this topic, I think that we have to talk about vampire history and how it shows up throughout different cultures all over the world. So creatures with vampiric characteristics have appeared in writings and folklore as far back as ancient Greece, which I kind of was not surprised by, but I found really interesting anyway. Mm-hmm. And in ancient Greece, there were stories told of creatures that attacked people in their sleep and drank their bodily fluids.
Right.
Tales of walking corpses that drank the blood of the living and spread the plague flourished in medieval Europe in times of diseases. Mm-hmm. People lacking the modern understanding of infectious diseases, though, came to believe that those who were vampires preyed first upon their own families. And research from the 20th and 21st centuries has posited that characteristics associated with vampires can be tracked back to very specific diseases. I looked up some examples. So porphyria, which makes one sensitive to sunlight.
Yep.
Tuberculosis, which, as we know, causes wasting. Pellagra, which is a disease that thins the skin. And rabies, which causes biting and general sensitivities that could lead to repulsion by light or garlic.
Well, additionally, rabies makes your brain go crazy.
Yeah, you go a little cuckoo bananas.
Yeah, and then you die because rabies is very dangerous.
Vampire myths were especially popular in Eastern Europe, and the word vampire most likely originates from that region. Digging up the bodies of suspected vampires was practiced in many cultures throughout Europe, and it is found that the natural characteristics of decomposition, such as receding gums and the appearance of growing hair and fingernails, reinforce the belief that corpses were in fact continuing some manner of life after death.
Right, because your skin recedes because there's no more collagen and no more actual fuel for it to continue to exist as the organ it is.
Also possibly contributing to this belief was the pronouncement of death for people who were not actually dead, which we know a lot about because it shows up all the time in a bunch of different stories.
Yeah, I think it's really funny because this obviously didn't just stay in Europe. It came over here and was pretty widely practiced. There's a huge story about this that it happened in, I want to say, New England.
It was the chick, right?
They dug up her mother, and her sister.
Yeah.
And then they powdered her heart.
Oh, Mercy Brown? Yeah, but I remember that from Aaron Mahnke.
Oh, yeah, Lord did it.
And he did it on the TV show, too.
Yes, he did.
Which I like the podcast better.
I do, too.
But yeah, no, that's real fascinating. Because of the constraints of medical diagnoses at the time, people who were very ill or sometimes very drunk and in a coma or shock, people thought that they were dead. Mm-hmm. And then they would, bring them to an area where they would be awaiting burial, and then they would miraculously come back to life because guess what? They weren't dead. And sometimes they would come back after it was a little bit too late to prevent their burial. And that sucks.
Yeah.
It's not my favorite thing to think about.
Well, that's where the bells came from. But that's also another reason that when they had wakes in their house for people to say goodbye to the body, that they would keep them on their dining room table for 3 days. Because that was about the time that they would start awakening if they were accidentally misdiagnosed as dead.
Yeah, and I've heard a whole bunch of stories about that. Belief in vampires led to such rituals as staking corpses through the heart before they were buried. Mm-hmm. In some cultures, the dead were buried face down to prevent them from finding their way out of their graves. For centuries, there have been stories of vampires told throughout Asia as well, which I really love these stories. So there's the Chinese Changxi, evil spirits that attack people and drain their life energy. And then you also have the blood-drinking wrathful deities, as they're called, and they appear in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Mm. So I love that they also show up in religious texts. Absolutely, yeah. Vampires have gone by many names, and this is going to be a little bit touchy for some people because I know that there's differing opinions on it. So I did go down a little wormhole with this. One popular name for them throughout Europe was Revenant. Mm-hmm. A lot of people get fussy about this because depending on who you ask, some people hold firm to the belief that vampires are initiated into vampirism while they're alive, and revenants return from the dead as reanimated corpses. I've also read that revenant was kind of used as an umbrella term for the undead, though. Right. Whatever the truth is, we know that it was widely used throughout Europe, and that revenants were feared in the same sort of manner that vampires were feared. Right. Well, they should be, though, because revenants are usually, like, wraithy type. In his book, Vampires, Burial, and Death, Folklore and Reality, folklorist Paul Barber noted that centuries ago, quote, often potential revenants can be identified at birth, usually by some abnormality, some defect, as when a child is born with teeth. Similarly suspicious were children born with an extra nipple. That comes from Romania, for example. Yeah, that's also associated with witches. Oh, okay. Witches' tit or the mole. Oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Also, when a child is born with a red caul or amniotic membrane covering its head, this was regarded throughout much of Europe as presumptive evidence that it is destined to return from the dead. Oh, and they also said that having a lack of cartilage in the nose or a split lower lip was another sign, and that comes from Russia. But one of my favorite things... Oh my God, I'm so excited to talk about this. I never get a chance to talk about this. One of my favorite things about all this vampire lore is that it became necessary for a book to be written about just how you go about spotting a vampire and then also how to kill them. And that was controversial at the time because, like I said, all these different cultures had their own beliefs on how you did that, how you spotted them, and then especially how you killed them, because some cultures were like, okay, so like you got to cut off the head and bury it by the feet, right? Right. Other cultures were like, but you stake it through its chest, and then you make sure that that stake goes into the ground, so it's like dead, but it's like really stuck there just in case. Right, right. And then other people were like, no, but you burn it, and then you scatter it to the 4 different directions. Right. You know? But it was like, no, girl, like, you got to read the Malus Maleficarum. That was the book, right? So... here's a quote from James B. Twitchell's book, The Living Dead, A Study of the Vampire in Romantic Literature. The process of ferreting out and punishing vampires was done by the book, and in this case, the book was one of the most extraordinary tracts ever given the papal seal, called the Malus Maleficarum, or the Witch's Hammer, was commissioned to take the guesswork out of the prosecution of witches werewolves, and vampires.
Also, fun fact, so on the churchofsatan.org, they also have an article on how to become a psychic vampire, should you need that clarification for yourself.
So you can get a free download of the Malleus Maleficarum
Outstanding.
at malleusmaleficarum.org.
Okay, good.
Because people have actually gone out of their way to make it available to the public because it is such a fascinating piece of both history and folklore.
Right.
So, okay, we talked a little bit about the history. Now we're going to come back and we're going to focus a little bit on New Orleans because that's our topic. We're talking about vampire folklore in New Orleans.
And it's super, super well ingrained in New Orleans culture.
Yeah, absolutely. After La Salle's discovery of the mouth of the Mississippi River, France established its first settlement on the lower Mississippi Valley in 1699, and New Orleans was founded in the spring of 1718. And the new colony was part of France's colonial expansion and used as a buffer against the colonial expansion of Spain and England. Because, girl, they were doing really well. And France was just like, no, we got this.
But I am tired.
It's important for people to understand something about the colonists in New Orleans at the time. Most of them were criminals that France did not want. And we are talking about murderers and rapists and a lot of people that were deemed criminally insane. Also just a lot of people, unfortunately, who were labeled as vagabonds. So for anybody who doesn't know exactly why that is, I'm going to illustrate for you. We're going to talk about it, girl. New Orleans was like straight up gross. It was not a good time, right? Nobody really wanted to go there. It would send a shiver down the spines of the French when they would think about moving to like a mosquito-infested, muggy, fever-laden swamp. Mm-hmm. The land was also unforgiving to vegetation, and they knew that your chances of living past 40 weren't really like looking too good.
Right.
You know? So in order for it to even become a city, it was necessary that they had a population, you know, and since nobody really wanted to go, they had to do something about that. So Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville, he was the governor and the man in charge of building this new colony, needed a lot of help. In fact, he needed somebody to provide him with this population. So he asked the French Company of the West, who were his money men, to please send some people on over so that he could make New Orleans a real thing with actual people and buildings. And they were like, okay, brosif. So somewhere around 50 convicts had been sent over from Canada and the other existing colonies like Biloxi to help Bienville clear the land and build some huts. But they either refused to work, fled, or died. As we said before, the conditions were pretty harsh.
Right, totally unlivable.
Mm-hmm. And Bienville needed to prove to France that he could successfully build a city here. Because he was very adamant about that location, which I think just because he's French and he was very stubborn. So to do this, he needed manpower. He needed this population, right? But like a real one, not just 50 people.
Right.
So let's take a minute. We're going to jump on over to Europe. Girl, at this time, 18th century, the War of Spanish Succession had just ended. There were tons of ex-soldiers returning to France from battle. They were unemployed. They were traumatized. Crime rates were spiking, and overcrowding was a huge issue in the jails and the asylums, and it was costing France like a butt ton of money.
Right. Well, of course.
So France was all like, girl, how are we going to fix this, right? So then they thought about it for a hot minute, and then they remembered, oh, wait, don't we have that shitty little swamp that Bienville's working on, right? Let's just send them all over there. That seems like a good idea, right? So France went ahead, and they emptied out the mental hospitals, the prisons. Even La Bastille was emptied out to send these people over.
Take all of our garbage.
Yes,
take this.
I mean, that was exactly it. And, you know, it wasn't really a bad idea because it was saving them a lot of money and, you know. Now, but this part's not so great. So this is the cherry on top of the shit sundae. They also rounded up, like I said, people who they considered to be vagabonds. So there were a lot of those people on the streets of Paris, and they were just like, you. There you go. See you later, girl. You know?
Bye.
Bye, bitch. So that is how the city was built. Mm-hmm. Just like I said, lots of murderers, lots of rapists, lots of undesirables.
Well, that's how Australia was built, and Australia's amazing.
Yeah, and so is New Orleans. So maybe that's the secret. There you go. As I'm sure you can imagine, the city was a little bit rough around the edges.
Well, and it still is.
With, lots of